I'm going to talk to you about the politics of redistribution in Brazil. So as part of this project, as Duncan has said, we're looking at episodes of redistribution that happened in various countries. And Brazil is a really interesting case to look at. And actually, Duncan's already stole my moment, but I'm also going to choose this picture of a favela in Rio. This is Rosinha, which is the biggest favela in the whole of Brazil, and possibly the Americas. And I bet many of you have seen this picture before, and this is often what we think of when we think about inequality in Brazil. And I think that's a really interesting image and to keep in mind. So thinking about the context in Brazil, it was a Portuguese colony, and it was the second biggest importer of slaves during the slave trade. Slavery actually was abolished quite late on, and it took a long time to enforce that. So these institutions really in Brazil evolved to be very extractive and egalitarian, serving a very small elite. The political system is multi-party, and there are lots of parties and very little party discipline. So you find when a leader gets in, they have to make some unholy alliances with really quite different coalition partners who have different visions, different ideologies. This means that reforms are really slow to get through, and there's lots of bargaining that goes on, and vote buying, which is one of the sort of big corruption scandals that's been emerging over the past few years. So we look at the nature of inequality in Brazil. We know that on average, Brazil is quite a wealthy country. It's an upper middle income country. It's the 7th biggest economy in the world. But it really has multiple inequalities across multiple dimensions: income, capital, color, region, urban, rural, gender, multiple. It's still the world's 10th most unequal country, but this is with a small data set. We're using a specific data set from 2001 is the last figure there. But that's the bad news. And the good news is that inequality has been falling, and really quite rapidly, relatively speaking. And that's mainly happened since 2000. And so we're really looking at why this has happened and what's the politics behind that. So if we move to this graph, we can see this fall. Now, this is the Gini index for Brazil from 1960, when data was being collected, to 2011. Now here, in blue, we see this is the period we're really looking at, where you see this sustained decrease in the level of inequality. But to really understand this decrease, we need to go back a bit in time. And really, we need to start from 1985, when the dictatorship ended. So that's where we're going to start with this episode. So if we look at this period from about 1985 to 1992, this is really when Brazil tore up its old system and wrote a new constitution and really made a new social contract. Now, the dictatorship ended in 1985 in the midst of a really significant economic crisis. After a decade of economic stagnation, the dictatorship had been completely delegitimized. It really had a lot of opposition emerging and becoming more confident from left-wing parties, from social activists, and from people on the street. So this constitution was written in a time where there was lots of participation and lots of groups. And in fact, it's an incredibly detailed document, and social policy is really at the front of it. And I mean the front, literally, I think it's the second or first chapter in the Constitution. And it sets out really ambitious standards like universal health rights, similar to what the NHS is. It's not to say that Brazil has been able to deliver these promises, but yet they're on paper, and this paper has shaped policy and reforms and ideas ever since this period. So what we find in this period is there was a real demand for change of the political system, the economic system, the social system. And talking about norms, Brazil knew it was, the phrase was used, the world champion of inequality. And they felt, Brazilians felt quite embarrassed about this and felt like this really was something that needed to change. Interestingly enough, more of the focus was on poverty than inequality. And sort of from survey data, it seems a bit like it was more of an instrumental view as opposed to an intrinsic view. But that's something to dig into deeper. So the final thing is that the Constitution also brought in a decentralization of power, making the country much more federal. So this even more added more complexity to this political bargaining that needed to go on. So now central government also had municipal and state governments to negotiate everything with, to buy people off, to buy people into reforms. So moving on to the next period, now really I feel sort of glossed over that we're going through 25 years very quickly here. So what we have at the end of this period of time is another economic crisis happening again, hyperinflation, which affects the poor incredibly hard. We also have a political crisis where we have the first democratically elected president ousted and impeached within 2 years. So within this context, we have the emergence of Fernando Henrique Cardoso, who came in as finance minister and 2 years later became president. And under him, they implemented an economic policy called the Real Plan, which is real as their currency. And that, over the medium term, stabilized the economy for really one of the sort of first periods in Brazilian history to stabilize the economy. This is actually really instrumental in reducing inequality. So really, during Cardoso's period, he focused on the economy. And he was actually a sociologist. He was quite left-wing, an expert in dependency theory. So, and he was really involved in writing the Constitution and bringing in a lot of those sort of social provisions. But when he got into government, the economy was a mess, and he focused on the economy and actually brought in quite a lot of neoliberal reforms. So it was quite surprising the change he made. But what's interesting in terms of his political style was that he was willing to make concessions and bargains. And this is a key feature that allowed him to stay in for 2 terms. He had to make these unholy alliances, and he had some really different coalition partners, some quite conservative members. And he had a very consensual style of making agreements and being able to get things done. So he actually managed to pass quite a lot of reforms and amendments even to this quite rigid constitution. One of the things he did was increase taxation during that period. Also, under his leadership, there was a growth of policy experimentation at the local level and participation. So what we found is that this new decentralized system gave a lot more responsibilities to municipal and state levels. And so you had these policy entrepreneurs at the local level. And this is actually where the birth of the very famous Bolsa Família program came from. There were 3 governors from different political parties in regions around Brazil who were experimenting with conditional cash transfers. And these amalgamated and over time got unified and brought out at the national level. So these actually did emerge at the local level on a sort of problem-solving basis. So finally, as I've already said, the neoliberal reform agenda really was tough on Brazilians, particularly on the poor. And if we remember this graph, you see here during Cardoso's time, up until about 2002, that inequality just stagnated. It didn't really change. So whilst the economy was slowly stabilizing, there was very little trickle down to the poor majority. So there was a repoliticization of social policy and social problems. And there was a real demand for change again. People wanted to see some gains really from this period. So it's within this context that we have the emergence of Lula. Now, of course, Lula didn't come from nowhere. Lula and the Workers' Party, the PT party, were the radical left party in Brazil who had started to emerge at the end of the dictatorship. They weren't that involved during the dictatorship, and they'd already been very politically active. Now, this was Lula's 4th time in trying to get elected as president. So he was determined to get in, and his party were confident that he was the person to bring them to power. But he hadn't got in, the party hadn't got in, probably because they were too radical. They hadn't been willing to make concessions. So it was at this point, really, that there was a real dramatic change in policy. And the PT party, Lula, wrote a very open letter to the public of Brazil and promised a certain level of continuity. They promised to come more to the center, and they promised that they wouldn't bring in radical reforms. So on this ticket, Lula got elected, and we had the Workers' Party come in. So the Workers' Party, to a certain extent, left behind some of their radical left policies. They maintained the economic policy almost intact from Cardoso's time. They maintained a lot of the social policies, and particularly the ones that were working, and scaled them up. And they also introduced some new ones. So in fact, it's this continuity which actually led to a lot of long-term results, which so often, like in the UK, you don't see when governments come in and completely change policies from one term to the next. And in terms of continuity, we also see a certain continuity in terms of ideology. Both Cardoso's party and Lula's party were centre-left and a bit with a certain divergence between the left. So this allowed a certain similarity in vision to really have this long-term results. So in terms of Lula's leadership, well, again, he had to make unholy alliances. He made a lot of alliances with the agricultural lobby, which was quite surprising when a lot of his support had come from the landless movement and smallholder farmers. Lulu was a very pragmatic leader. He was a great negotiator. Again, like Cardoso, he had to make these agreements with all these parties to get things done. And he was also very charismatic. Now, the centerpiece of the PT's time in power, and if we think about Lulu was in power for 2 terms. Subsequently, the person he put forward, Dilma, came into power and was re-elected for a 2nd term just last year. So they've really been a very successful party. So the cornerstone of their policy and approach has been the zero hunger strategy. So the idea, and this is what the mandate was as well when Lula was elected, was that every Brazilian should be able to have 3 meals a day. No one should go hungry. And this was actually a very simple narrative and one that everyone could agree to. It wasn't talking about inequality, about taking from the wealthy. It was talking about giving a bit more to people at the bottom of the spectrum. So what Lula brought in, one of the most significant policy changes was increasing the minimum wage. Now, the minimum wage had been incredibly low throughout history and throughout Cardoso's time as well. And so consistently throughout this period, he raised the minimum wage. This brought immense opportunities to people at the bottom, bringing a lot more wealth. Of course, people at the bottom of the income spectrum tend to spend more of their money in their local areas. So this really generated a big multiplier effect. What Lula also did, which I mentioned, was he expanded social policies. So Bolsa Familia did exist in a form before, by coming through from Cardoso, like I explained. And Bolsa Familia is very famous in terms of paying families so their children go to school and are vaccinated, and has been incredibly successful. What Lula's administration did is they massively scaled this up. They increased immensely the amount of people receiving this money. They still have a long way to go, but they also targeted it much more clearly. So really, these policies show that there is a certain level of continuity carrying on, but an expansion of things that were successful. Now, the interesting sort of history, a bit of the history behind this scaling up of Bolsa Familia is that when Lula arrived in power, he had quite a different strategy, which was also called Zero Hunger, but he kept the name so that he didn't lose face. And immediately when he got into power, he had this idea to deliver cash and food to families around the country, but it wasn't very successful. Within a few years, it was quite clear to see there were real difficulties in rolling out this policy. So some experts came to him, some economists at the time, and had projections of if they scaled up this smaller program at the time, these collection of programs, what might be the results in the long term. And Lula had quite a lot of resistance within the Workers' Party because actually it seemed like a bit of a neoliberal approach to make people have conditions for receiving money. It wasn't this kind of European approach where everyone just deserves to have a basic level of welfare. People had to do something for it. So he had that resistance, but he really managed that politics, saw an opportunity and took it, and kept the name of his overarching strategy on which he was elected. So he managed to take the credit for a lot of the success of that program. So finally, in conclusion, there are a few sort of really important elements that have come through this case study. The first is the importance of taking advantage of critical junctures. And behind this is critical junctures, for example, the end of the dictatorship. If there hasn't been already a great emergence and organization of social movements or parties, they can't take advantage of that. So it's not just something happens and then people fill the gap. That is thinking about the long term, when these critical junctures happening, how to leverage what capacity there is already in the country for taking advantage of that. Second important point is, in Brazilian case, the importance of pragmatic leaders who are willing to make concessions and are able to get people on board with their policies. The third important point is localized policy experimentation and participation. Now this, at the local level, meant that problems were focused on and solutions were found that were culturally relevant, and then they were scaled up when they were found to be successful. The next point is continuity. So this continuity over now 6 terms of government of the successful policies. And of course, there were lots of unsuccessful policies that were left by the wayside. But this is really allowed to have these results in the longer term. But the final and overarching point is that Brazil is still very unequal, about the 10th most unequal country in the world. It's still got a massively long way to go. And if many of you were watching the news in 2013, you might have seen this eruption of political protests in Brazil. It's potentially the biggest protest Brazil's ever seen, at least maybe since the impeachment of the president I told you about earlier. What we see here is that the protests were completely disorganized, and although there were organized elements within it, there were multiple demands. So this banner here says, when your son is sick, take him to the stadium, talking about football stadium because of the FIFA World Cup. This one here in the middle says, the cup of corruption, again talking about the World Cup. This one here is talking about violence. And really, I tried to find a mix, but there's an amazing amount of different messages that people had. But what we gather from all of this is that there's a dissatisfaction with the state. Now, interestingly, not a lot of the banners talked about the 1%, which is what we saw, say, in Europe and America, but they're talking about issues related to inequality. So these are inequalities of access to services, and quality is still incredibly low on many public services. Violence, which is very clearly linked to certain elements. And I'd just like to also point out here the banner in the background, the flag. And so Brazil is very nationalistic, has a real sense of nation, is really quite homogeneous in terms of this sense. So I think actually there's a lot of hope in terms of bringing together this sense of the nation, in terms of maintaining and keeping this reduction of inequality.